Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Riata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Happy to have you back on another episode. Today's titillating title is Ruled by the Ruler. No, don't turn off yet. It's really a good topic. It just sounds a little boring.
What are we measuring? That depends on how boring it is.
Don't start. This is a commercial real estate podcast. I think we've covered that before.
Well,
I still like the little tagline you used to use about your foot fetish.
well,
Check off on that one.
So I made the mistake one time in a networking group, business group I was in. Everybody'd get up and kind of give their introduction, and I got up one time and I said, "All right, people, I have a confession. I have a foot fetish." And a bunch of the people were like, "What?" They got kind of a little freaked out, and I said, "But I have a very unique foot fetish. I like square feet." And I like people with a lot of square feet. The more square feet they have, the better. and it was funny because there's one guy, Cliff, who was a member, and he remembered that. And I swear, years and years later, 10 years later, well, maybe not.
It wasn't just him. I think there were a couple of ladies that remembered it too. They keep talking about it.
Why, thank you.
Okay. Why is square feet important, and why are we talking about it today?
All right. Well, this all comes from chapter 5 of my book. So my book is Confessions of a Recovering Landlord. So, I was a landlord guy for 20 years. Then I switched sides to represent the user only 19 years ago. So I wrote this book called, why is that funny?
Just the way you said only 19 years ago. So basically 20 years landlord and 20 years tenant rep. We're old, let's face it.
I am a mathematician. So chapter 7 of that book is called Ruled by the Ruler. And the idea of it was, talking about all kinds of stuff related to square feet and leases. So I start off that chapter talking about Sydney, who I met at a class of some sort. I think it was a class given by one of the small business development centers in the Dallas area. And she found out that I was in commercial real estate. And she, grabbed me after the meeting, and she said, "Hey, I want to see if you can give me some advice. I signed a lease for a retail space, and it was it was a bigger space, 20,000 square feet, let's say, and she only leased 2,000 square feet of it, or so she thought. The demising wall had not been built yet. The demising wall is just the wall that separates tenants." And she said, "We finished doing the space planning for my space, and it turns out that the landlord says my demising wall is going to be in a slightly different spot than what they had estimated it to be when we signed the lease. So now, instead of my lease actually being for 2,000 square feet, it's for 2,100 square feet." I was like, "Oh, okay, 100 square feet. That's not a big deal." She goes, "Yeah, but you got to understand, 100 square feet extra is a lot of money to me. And my monthly rent is going to be higher, especially when you consider it's not just based on the, on the base rent, but it's also on the operating expenses, the triple nets that are of all the operating expenses that are passed through to the tenant." And so she was freaking out about that. And she wanted to know, what can she do about that? How can she avoid that extra cost? And I said, "Well, you probably can't. Your lease probably has language in it that says that the square footage is an estimate and the final number will be determined by the landlord's architect, and that's what it'll be." And I said, if the demising wall hadn't been built, I don't really know what other option there might have been other than to have had the architect come out there and, determine what it is when you sign the lease and be 100% clear and sure on where it is. This is particularly an issue, not just when you have a space that is going to be demised and you don't know exactly where the demising wall is going to turn out to be. It's also a problem, especially when it's a brand new building being constructed that hasn't been finalized yet, because, there's things that change as you're constructing a building, right? Hey, we have to turn this a little differently than we thought because of whatever condition on the property. So, and hers was a brand new building that was under construction when she signed her lease, et cetera. So she was just kind of freaking out about it. So bottom line is, the question became, what does she do? And I said, other than talking to your tenant rep that you used and your attorney that you used, I don't really know that there's anything I can tell you. And you're laughing because you're way ahead of me, right?
Well, you're making a point and I'm just serving it up here.
Silver platter, meat Bob. Yeah, she hadn't used a tenant rep. She just called the name on the sign. And of course, that person represented the landlord, and she had not used an attorney. She just signed the lease as it was handed to her by the landlord, not knowing. I mean, it was her first time ever doing a lease, right? And she was a first-time business owner, and she'd gotten an SBA loan. And so she didn't know that she can negotiate, that she can have an attorney, she can have a corporate real estate advisor, tenant rep on her side. So she was unfortunately just stuck, and she was just going to have to live with it. And so it was a sad story, but it kind of brings into this whole discussion, what is the significance of square feet, and are there different kinds of square feet? And the answer, of course, is yes. So
round feet, triangle feet,
well,
parallelogram feet.
There actually are all those things, but spaces are shaped in all kinds of ways. You can lease a space that's square, rectangular, triangular, circular, you name it. Polygonal. I'm not sure how to.
That's something you have surgery for.
or at least a cream, medicated cream for. So, if anybody ever listens to this, which I think is highly doubtful, hopefully we'll get some comments back on this. But anyway.
Well, I also want to interject that you're talking about new build, but we just recently had this happen on a fairly old building on a client that we were renewing, and we were arguing over square footage and how that played out. So it's not just new build.
Well, and you're right. The square footage can be something that can become an issue. So let's start off first with sort of explaining what square footages are and the different types of them are. So in most buildings, there are, let's make a distinction between, let's say, a single tenant building versus a multi-tenant building, and also the difference between a building that has common area and a building that doesn't. So a single tenant building, well, the entire building is leased by one company. So whatever that square footage is the square footage. So let's say the building is, 70,000 square feet. You've measured it. The architect has measured it, and, it's 70,000 feet, sort of end of story, right? Well, who determines what that square footage is? Well, as I just said, it's usually the architect, either the architect who was the architect of record when the building was built, or it could be a new architect that the landlord hired to measure the building after they bought the building. I've mentioned on the podcast many times that the last company I worked for, where I was an asset manager for an owner investor, we remeasured every office building we bought over, the whole time I was with the company. And we wanted to have the most accurate square footage, and laser measuring devices are far more accurate than the devices that were used in the 80s when most of the buildings we bought were built. So we've found that the buildings were actually bigger than what we had thought they were when we bought them. So it is typically going to be done by an architect or a space planner or a space measuring company.
Why wouldn't you measure the building before you bought it? And that smart you didn't, but I would normally think I would want to make sure I'm paying, because it's priced per square foot.
Well, it's priced, we think of everything in terms of square feet, the price per square foot, the rent per square foot, the expenses per square foot, all that kind of thing. So you're right. And some people will measure it before closing. And I'm sure that some of the buildings that we bought were measured beforehand, but sometimes it couldn't get done until after, or we didn't start measuring buildings for a few years after I joined the company. So we went back and measured the buildings that we had already bought as well, because that was just a new thing that we started doing. But yeah, I mean, verifying what you're being told by a landlord or by a seller would be ideal. In a lot of cases, those buildings, we had CAD files available to us. And so we
CAD.
Computer aided design. So it's a computer system for measuring and designing buildings. So architects use those all the time. So anyway, so back to the thing. So the architects measure the building. Well, how do they know what the standard for that is? Do they measure from the inside of the wall, the outside of the wall? What if there's an overhang, for the front door and it's kind of recessed? Who decides all that? Well, BOMA. That's BOMA, exactly. So BOMA is Building Owners and Managers Association. And BOMA is the entity that in the United States anyway, pretty much decides what the standard is. And that may change over time. And they will issue a new sort of ruling or standard, just like edicts. Yes. So just like the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or FASB, determines what is GAAP accounting, generally accepted accounting principles, BOMA determines what the way to measure where space is: office buildings, warehouse buildings, retail buildings. There are exceptions though, like in New York. New York sort of has their own way of doing it, New York City. So, it depends on where you are. Some leases will actually quote the standard. We are going to be held accountable to the BOMA 1996 or 2006 or whatever standard of measuring the building. Most leases, however, these days stipulate a square footage. So they'll say, the tenant and the landlord agree and stipulate that the square footage is 70,000 square feet and is not subject to being remeasured at any later date in the deal. So as long as that lease is in effect, that's going to be the square footage, and it doesn't matter who remeasures what. Too bad, that's what it's going to be. So the square footage is determined by the architect, which is using the BOMA standard. So a single tenant building, that tenant's paying for the whole thing. As soon as you have a multi-tenant building, now you got to split it. And so now let's say it's a warehouse or a retail where there is no common area. So you're just putting in a wall in the middle of a space. So you have a 70,000 foot space, you put a wall down the middle, should be 35,000 square feet each, right? Well, what if you put the wall somewhere else that's not in the middle? Or are you going to put many walls in that 70,000 square feet? You can have 10 tenants. Well, the demising wall, so you measure to the midpoint of the demising wall. Well, can a tenant use to the midpoint of the demising wall? Well, all right, if that demising wall is, let's say 6 inches thick, well, they each have 3 inches that they're not sort of really able to use, but it's assumed that it is considered usable square footage to the tenant. And so in these kinds of buildings where there is no common area, the usable square footage, the amount they actually get to use, is the same as the rentable square footage, rentable being what you pay on. Well, now let's switch sides and say, what if there's common area? So the best example of this is a common area, a multi-tenant office building. You walk into the first floor of the office building, there is a lobby. Maybe there's a security guard sitting there. Maybe there's a little sort of tenant lounge area with some seating. And then you go into public bathrooms, restroom. Mechanical rooms. So like there's a room for the electrical, for the air conditioning, mechanical equipment, for the phone room. Maybe there's a janitor's closet. So there's all these things that maybe they're behind a key, but they're actually all for the benefit of the tenant. And so those are called common areas, and those common areas have to be allocated to the tenants throughout the building. So if you have a 100,000 square foot building with 10,000 square feet of common area, well, that is a 10% load factor or a 10% add-on factor. There's a lot of names for the factor, but bottom line is the usable square footage of the building is 90,000 square feet. The rentable is 100,000 square feet because you've allocated the 10,000 square feet of common across the entire building. And so each tenant pays their share of the common area load or the add-on factor. So whenever a tenant comes in and says, well, I measured my space and I've only got 6,000 square feet, not 7,000 square feet, what's going on? Well, number one, they're measuring to the inside of the walls, not to the midpoint of the walls. And the midpoint is just for the demising walls. It's not for the exterior walls. Exterior walls, you may, measure to the outside of the wall. And then you also have to add in the common area factor. So anybody that goes in and measures to the inside of a wall is always going to be confused as to the square footage of a space. So all these things come into play in trying to determine what you're actually going to pay for. And whenever you start evaluating one building versus another, well, now you have the problem of, well, one building may have a 10% factor, another may have a 15% factor, another one may have a 20% factor. And that is what determines the efficiency of a building. So the efficiency is typically, if I'm going to be able to lease 9,000 square feet of usable space in 3 different buildings, what is the rentable square feet in each of those buildings? Because that's what I'm paying the rent on. So assuming that you have the same rental rate in each of those buildings, the building with the lowest factor is going to be the lowest cost. Now, that also may, however, come back to bite you, because what kind of building do you want to be in?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to be in
a trying to project for your employees, your clients?
Exactly. A lot of it's image. Mm-hmm. So you went to the very most important thing first. So if I'm going to be let's say a consulting company, I'm going to be McKinsey or Bain or Boston Consulting Group, one of these that they want a really, really high image, not only for their clients, but also for the consultants that they hire. They want to hire the best coming out of Ivy League schools. They want a really impressive building. Well, what do impressive buildings have? Big lobbies, lots of amenities. And a lot of times those amenities are considered common areas. So if you have a tenant lounge, that's a common area. If you have a common conference room that's available to the tenants, or a training room, that could be considered common area. So now all of a sudden, with the race among landlords to have all the coolest common areas, rooftop lounge, that could increase your common area factor. So now instead of it being 15%, all of a sudden it's 20 or 22 or even more. I had a building when I was on the landlord side where we remeasured the building, and we thought the common area factor was probably around 20%. Oh no, it was 30%. I think it was actually over 30%. Because it had these giant, it was only a 3-story building. It had a giant lobby, and then it had these giant atriums that were landscaped with fountains in them on each wing of the building. So, I mean, it was an enormous amount, and it was only 130,000 foot building, we thought. And so, we were like, all right, we've remeasured this thing. The actual factor is over 30%. The building in reality is now, call it 150,000 square feet, not 130,000 square feet. So we technically could have allocated the extra 20,000 square feet among all those tenants. And as leases expired, or as we leased up new space, we could have tried to get that. But the problem was, smart tenant rep agents are going to evaluate one building versus the other based on the efficiency we just talked about. And we knew that for a market rental rate, we were suddenly going to be far more expensive than the other buildings, because the actual amount of space, of usable space a company was going to be able to lease from us was going to be a lot more expensive on a usable square foot basis. So it's smart for a company or tenant rep to evaluate buildings not just based on how many rentable square feet a tenant's going to lease or what's the rental rate, but what is the rentable square footage. And then you look at that and say, all right, we apply the rental rate to the rentable square footage, but then we divide that by the usable square footage to determine what is the cost per usable square foot. That's really where you get down to the real best number to evaluate one building versus another, assuming the buildings are apples to apples.
I don't like the term usable, though, because I hear tenants say, I don't use that. I don't use that feature. That's immaterial to me. And then I'm like, well, okay, then you should have factored that in when you looked at this building to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's just
for some tenants, it's going to be really important, and other tenants won't care. So they need to know that going in.
They do. But it's also, hopefully they have clearly defined, and the corporate real estate advisor has led the client through a conversation of what you talked about earlier, which is an image. So what kind of image do you want? What kind of building do you want? What kind of amenities are you expecting? And if you know that going in, then hopefully you're comparing comparable buildings. You're not comparing some, 1972 suburban office building in the worst submarket with no amenities to some class AA building in uptown with all the latest stuff. That would not make any sense on a lot of levels, not just usable or rentable. So this is where you get into the significance of square feet and how is it measured and add-on factors and all this kind of thing. So and what's also interesting is some buildings will take the amenities like the conference rooms and the tenant lounges and these kinds of things that I talked about, and will consider those common areas and pass those through as a higher common area factor, and other buildings won't. And so the distinction a lot of times is, let's just take the example of a fitness center or a common conference room. Well, does the landlord charge for the use of those things? Mm-hmm. If the answer is yes, they charge for that, then that shouldn't be common area, because they're getting paid for the use of those things.
Double dipping,
exactly.
But another thing that the tenant has to think about is, I was showing space to a client of ours the other day, and we were looking at a common conference room that could be booked, but you can't keep your stuff in there. You have to carry all your stuff in. That was important to them. And then the other thing is, you just pay for that as you need. Whereas if it was inside their space, they're paying for it 24/7.
Right.
So outsourcing something that you need, but is still in the same building, is a great way to look at it as well for something like a conference room.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if your company is only going to have a once a month training session that's going to need 50 people in the room, well, don't put that in your space. If the building has a common conference room that can seat 50 people, it'd be better to spend, $300, $500, whatever, a month to do that, or to go to a hotel and rent that room, even though that's going to be a lot more money. It may be cheaper to do that than to have that in your space and be paying whatever the rent per square foot is on that all the time. But back to my point on common areas, whether or not the landlord charges for the use of those rooms should determine whether or not it's considered common area. If the fitness center is free to all tenants and their employees, that's common area. It's equally available to everybody. But if I have to pay for it, well, now some of my employees will pay for it and some won't. Some companies will provide it for their employees, some won't. That's not common anymore. So is it...
Where they get around that in some cases is, it's common area. You can go in there. But if you're going to have a personal trainer, or if you're going to join this class, that's an add-on.
Well, that's additional
services. Itself is there for you. Yeah.
But that's no different than what's considered an above standard service for a lot of buildings. So, for example, if a building has a security guard, and that security guard is there in the lobby and patrols the building 24/7, that's for the benefit of all the tenants. But now one tenant is going to have a party and they want extra coverage of security guards because it's going to occur. The party's going to go after 6 o'clock when the building normally shuts down. The building's going to be left unlocked for those guests to come and go at will. And they're going to be there until 9 o'clock. Well, so they should be required to have extra security guards on staff to help with that. And that's for the benefit of that only that one company. Therefore, that one company should pay the incremental cost of that. That's an above standard service. And that's the way I would look at that, what you just described as well.
For the gym. Yeah.
So
you were talking about how the example of Sydney had done this by not using a corporate tenant rep to help her.
Right.
How would she have known that when she called from the get? She was just driving by and looking at a sign and calling someone. How does an inexperienced tenant know from the get that person's representing the landlord? I need someone to represent me.
That's a good question. I mean, if you don't know something exists, how do you know you need it and you would benefit from it? And that's sort of a chicken and egg problem, right? Hopefully, when she called that leasing agent on the sign, the leasing agent not only sent her the information about brokerage services form that they are legally required to provide,
right,
but that they also explained what that form was. So the problem is that a lot of the times they will send that, or it'll just be the last page of a flyer, but nobody explains what that really means. And the whole point of that form is so that tenants, clients in any real estate transaction where there is a licensed real estate agent involved, that real estate agent delivers that to all parties and explains who he or she represents.
Mm-hmm.
And
probably, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and whenever they explain who they represent, which in the case of the leasing agent on the sign would say, I'm representing the landlord, my fiduciary responsibility is to the landlord. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that'll send off a light bulb in the mind of the tenant who says, wait a minute, does that mean I should have somebody represent me?
Right. As I recall, you came into a deal after someone had already done this, like a Sydney. They'd called the landlord, they maybe have seen the space, then they found out, oh, I need representation. You came on and the landlord tried to cut you out and said, no, this isn't going to happen. If I remember right, you said, okay, well, just go ahead and show me where you told them who you represented and that you did present them with an IABS. And next thing I know, you had a commission agreement.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that exact scenario. It was really more one in which one of our clients got a little ahead of herself and went and looked at a property without including me, because she was just so excited about this property. She called on the sign and the guy's like, oh yeah, I'm just down the street. And so he ran over and showed her the space. And then she called me and said, hey, I'm really interested in this one. I was like, oh, so you went ahead and looked at it? And she said, yeah. I said, okay. So I called the broker and, the leasing agent, mm-hmm. and the leasing agent said, oh, well, I'm going to represent her on that building. I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I showed her the space. I said, but it's your listing. He said, no, it's my broker's listing. And I said, okay. So did you show her the IABS form and explain to her who you represented? And he's like, hold, please. And next thing I know, his broker came on the line. And let's just say she was the ice queen. She was not happy about this conversation. And so what was funny is that she knew the law. And she knew that he should have given her an IABS, should have explained who he represented. And he should have said, I want to represent you, at which point she would have said, oh, I've already got Bob at Briato Commercial Realty representing me. And that would have cleared all this up in an instant. But they didn't do that. He thought he was going to be able to find a way to weasel his way in to represent her, even though his broker was the person that had the listing and had the fiduciary responsibility to the landlord. which means you cannot be in what's called an intermediary capacity, where the broker is on one side of the transaction and one of the broker's agents is on the other side of the transaction, because that agent is theoretically being supervised by the broker. So those two people cannot be on opposite sides of a transaction. If they're going to work as an intermediary situation, then that guy that showed her the building could have been representing her, and then another agent in the office, but not the broker, could be assigned to represent the landlord. And then that's what's called an intermediary with assignments. And this is really where the problem comes in with a lot of the big shops, where you have somebody from, pick a company, JLL, CBRE, Cushman & Wakefield, whatever. So you have one agent representing the landlord and another agent in the same shop representing the tenant. Are those two parties being fully informed as to who represents whom, and that they're now in an intermediary capacity? I can't say for sure, and certainly I would not make a blanket statement, but I would bet that often the answer to that would be no. But we're kind of off the subject of square feet, but it's relevant. You're right.
But anytime I can show the importance of having a tenant rep broker, I'm going to serve that up to you.
Especially a Riata Commercial Realty real estate advisor. Anyway, any other things we ought to talk about?
Well, just were there any other main takeaways or summarization of chapter 7 in the book that you wanted to highlight? And also, I just want to make sure our listeners knew that if they'd like a free copy of chapter 7, if they email me at jan@texastenantrep.com, I'll email it to them.
Well, look at you.
Yeah. Always be selling.
Always be providing value. So I would say if you look at chapter 7, sort of the big chapter takeaways, if you will. Number one, know the difference between rentable and usable. You don't need to know exactly how it's calculated necessarily, but know the difference.
And know what you're paying for and what you're using, just what those terms really, really mean.
So number 2, determine the type of building and amenities you want, and then compare similar buildings. Don't be apples to oranges. Number 3, calculate the rent as a total dollar amount, as a dollars per square foot rentable and dollars per square foot usable, but also dollars per employee. Because if you look at the build, what really matters to a company, if I can go put 75 tenant employees in that building, but I'm only going to be able to put 72 in that building, well, what's the cost per employee of each of those situations? That may be the most relevant metric. Number 4, stipulate the square footage of your space in the total building and the lease. I did mention that previously. Don't just stipulate the square footage of the space, also show the square footage of the building, so you know what your pro rata share is that you're going to be responsible for when they pass through the operating expenses. So don't subject yourself to the risk of a different number coming in. I mean, that number could come to your benefit if they come up with a smaller square footage, but let's be honest, if a landlord remeasures a space and it's smaller, they're not going to tell you. It's only going to come up if it's bigger. So don't subject yourself to that. So stipulate it. And then the last thing is, if you lease part of a larger space, allow for only a single remeasurement. Only at that one point in time can it be remeasured, and not again and again and again over the life of the lease term. Because, it's possible that if you do a 10-year lease, that building could sell a time or 2 or 3 during your tenancy. Don't let every new landlord that walks in the door remeasure and throw out a different number.
Now, of course, this is not applicable when you expand your space or redact your space, you change your space, your footprint in that building.
All of that is subject. Yeah, all that's subject to a measurement of that additional space. And I'll tell you that, whenever I was an asset manager and we had remeasured a building, when the building was bigger or the space was bigger, anytime something significant changed in that lease situation, we would try to adjust the square footage to whatever we determined to be the correct number. So if a tenant came to us and said, hey, I'm going to renew my lease, well, we would try to, implement the new square footage. If they wanted to expand, we would not only use that new square footage for the expansion space, but we would also try to adjust it for the existing space. And, that didn't always happen, because sometimes they would say, well, that means I'm going to have to pay an extra whatever. We would actually, let's just say, the tenant we wanted the tenant to stay, but we knew that they weren't going to pay both an increased rental rate and based on an increased square footage. We might say, all right, we'll apply the square foot, the rental rate to the old square footage, but we're going to go ahead and show the new square footage, and that will result in a slightly smaller rental rate per square foot because we're using a bigger square footage. But it was important to get that bigger square footage into the lease so that the next time the lease renews or we go to sell the building, we got the bigger square footage, which is more valuable.
Yeah. Well, if you would like a copy of this book that includes Chapter 7, it's available on Amazon.
Confessions of a Recovering Landlord. Get you one.
Thanks for listening. We appreciate your time. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.